Welcome once again to Crossroads TV, where we host China experts right here on the ground in Shanghai. This is the online component of China Crossroads, where I've hosted hundreds of speakers over the last decade in Shanghai. Huge honor to have Don Weinland of The Economist. He's the China business and finance editor here. So we want to ask him first about his work here, and specifically, what are some of the challenges you experienced doing your job here?
Yeah, it's a really interesting and big question, I think. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what it's like to work as a journalist in China. Obviously, this is not an ideal environment to work in as a journalist. It's the government is not particularly happy with a lot of the work that global journalists do, or the work that global papers produce. Often is looked at as being very negative. So it's just from that point of view, it can be very, very difficult. I think that so I'm a business and finance reporter. I'm not doing human rights reporting. I'm not going to Xinjiang or Tibet all the time. So it's probably a bit easier for me to get around and to work in this environment. I would say. We can talk about some of the things that make kind of like day-to-day journalism difficult. I would say the most difficult part of my job is just talking with local companies. There's really no upside these days for a large local company to talk with global media. Seeing their name in an international paper. It brings a lot of risk. So just getting access to companies, I would say, is my number one problem. And I would add to that, it's not just local companies. It's multinationals that do work in China as well. They are also hesitant to talk with journalists.
So you got to work harder to get a story out, and that's been changing over time. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think 10 to 15 years ago, if you were a journalist working for a global publication, local companies wanted to see their names in these papers. Now if a company name or an executive name appears alongside, a senior leader or something like that, or if the article has a generally negative slant to it. That's going to bring that could bring problems to the company, or at least it's not going to make the company feel very comfortable, I would say.
I want to go from small ball to big picture, so I'm going to ask you a series of brief questions.
Okay.
Are you followed?
Not in Shanghai or any big city.
Okay. Have you experienced any kind of security threats to your person while reporting here?
Security threats? I would say no.
Okay. Moving on to maybe a bigger picture question. So, we see a lot of reporting on China in the West that at least, we in Shanghai think doesn't really reflect the reality here. And, there are fewer and fewer foreign journalists here. I mean, how do you feel about the quality of the other work by other China journalists here? And is it really capturing the reality for the West?
I think the more journalists that are on the ground, the better for the quality of reporting on China. I mean, I'd like to hear an argument, that makes the case, the opposite case. Having reporters write about China from other places around Asia, because they can't get into China, it's not going to help. Those people don't have contact with locals on the ground here. It's very hard to kind of, get a sense of what things are really like here. So it's not that I don't respect or find informative the work that's being produced by journalists that are outside of China. I mean, often they do very, very good work. Yeah. They talk with people. There's an increasingly large group of China people that are based outside of China now. I think this kind of started with COVID. People kind of left the country, and so you have a bunch of experts in Washington and London and all over the place. There's a different. A lot of that reporting has a different tone to it, but it's very important to have people on the ground here.
So how specifically does your being in China, physically here and being a China hand, does that make your work better?
Oh, well, I mean, I would say day to day, walking down the street in Shanghai and kind of seeing the reality of what this country's like, or getting out to a third or fourth tier city and kind of talking with people there. Just on my cab ride over here, I was talking with the cab driver. We had this awesome conversation about how he used to work in internet security, and now he's driving like an Uber style cab. You don't get those conversations, obviously, if you're outside of China. So it's I think that probably covers it, right?
Why is it then still you're sitting here? I don't know, Bloomberg has a big office in Shanghai also. Some others are not here. What's the main reason behind that? Do they want to be here, or are there issues with the governments?
Oh, I think there are lots of people that want to be, lots of China-focused journalists that want to be in China now. It's very hard to get a visa these days. I waited, I think it was about a year and a half to get my visa. That's pretty standard now. So, China's reopened from COVID, right? It's granting all these visa-free entry to people around the world. Great. That hasn't really come back for journalists. So it's still very slow. I think people working for American papers, American news organizations have it a lot harder. I work for a British news organization, which might make it a bit easier. I think the American publications have it the worst, or the Canadian publications as well. I think there are lots of people that would prefer to be here rather than, say, Singapore.
Yes, I can imagine. So in the end of the day, so where you come from does make a difference nowadays. China's now, of course, heavily focusing on Europe. A lot of Chinese governments going to Europe to promote themselves and attract European companies, because I think, the US is much harder nowadays. So that's the same basically what you're telling for the media world.
Oh, absolutely. Back in 2019, 2020, there were a lot of American newspaper journalists that were kicked out. It's very clearly based on kind of, where your publication is from. I think that's it's well established.
So The Economist, it's a liberal paper, and it's got a consistent line about state non-interference in the market, society, and you wouldn't expect that the government here would take kindly to that, but you operate fine here. Do you have any thoughts about why you're given such scope besides just being British?
That's an interesting question. You're correct that my paper does have kind of this this small L liberal stance. I don't know if that really has much bearing on kind of like what when they're thinking about like visa approvals.
Maybe they don't read it.
Somebody's reading us. The ins and outs of kind of visa approval, as we were just saying, I think it has a lot less to do with kind of the very specific views of this paper or that paper. It's much more based on kind of where the paper is based.
But The Economist can be found actually on Xiaohongshu, Little Red Book, where some things are translated basically. So the Chinese do know The Economist actually.
Yes. Well, one thing that I'm told very frequently is that by Chinese people is that they when they were in college, they learned English through The Economist,
right.
Which is great. Yes. I think lots of international media articles pop up on Chinese social media, like Xiaohongshu, and often it is a positive comment about China. Sometimes from articles that I've written, where whoever's translated says, "Oh, look, so and so has said something nice about China," and they publish that on social media. If there's some negative factors to the story, that might not be published on Chinese social media. So that, I think there's probably some young people who get to know foreign publications through social media. Yeah.
You mentioned people learning English through The Economist. Back when I was in the Economist Intelligence Unit office, we didn't overlap. I can't remember his name. There was one guy in charge of the Chinese publication, and they had a huge following. People, young adults would, have these reading groups of The Economist. And our friend Graham Earnshaw is doing really well at Forbes now because he's the foreign figurehead, and Forbes is doing really well too with this kind of like, idea that you read financial publications and then I guess you will make money in the future, something like that.
Makes sense.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
The demand for real information about what's going on globally is high. So I don't think that that's special to people in the U.S., people in Europe. I think
Yeah.
people in China want to know what's going on. So if they, certainly if they can find access to it, then I think they'll take it.
What a great brand you have.
It's an interesting remark you just said. I always figure that Chinese, of course, although they are exposed to a certain censorship in this country, I would say, but very often they do know more about Europe than he has, and actually Europe than he has knows about China. I figured out very, very strangely very often.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to tell. China has many things going on at once. I remember last year talking with a bar owner somewhere in Shanghai who, he didn't seem like he'd be somebody that would be paying attention to kind of global events. He was running a very small bar. But he told me, I fan qiang, like I hop the Great Firewall, and so I know what's going on out there, and did he seem more exposed to kind of crazy conspiracy theories? Yes, but he also seemed like he, had a view on, things that were going on globally. I don't know, people in Europe, even though most of them have kind of free access to the internet, I do wonder, if they're using that, and if they're as informed as we would hope.
Talking about informed as we would hope, I think nowadays multinationals having, as we know, a much harder time in China, and I think they're very much confused about the new China strategy and the new China play, basically. Does that do with lack of information, or the markets are more harder, or what do you think is the real reason behind that?
Well, I would argue that, when it becomes difficult for journalists to operate freely in China, that the information that multinationals are getting deteriorates. So the better the reporting conditions are in China, it's probably better for multinationals. So during the COVID years, I would hear from people in MNCs that would say, gosh, everything that I'm reading now is written from, it's written from Singapore, it's written from London, that's really a shame. I don't really get a sense of what's actually happening in the country. So I think absolutely that, the information environment is not what it should be. And this impacts multinationals for sure.
When I met a lot of automotive companies, especially German ones, they really, after COVID, China opened up, they come back to China, and they were surprised, amazed how China evolved in the EV space. And it's surprising because it's a huge market already. Volkswagen is huge here, and still they missed all of this. That was absolutely astonishing, I would say.
I mean, the entire world has been blown away by what you just said, kind of the reopening of China, and then suddenly it's like, oh yeah, we now dominate the EV sector and the lithium-ion battery sector. I mean, this was all happening. I think it kind of crept up on everybody, but very surprising.
But this wasn't underreported. I mean, that was the news for a long time. So how come they missed this? Was this a lack of information? I mean, they have huge teams here in China.
It's a good question. I think if you go back and you look at the reporting record, you see the number of cars that are being produced every year. BYD, the EV company, they publish the number of cars that they sell. So I think, whether it was missed, I would push back against that. I don't think it was. It potentially was not framed correctly, and global publications were probably not predicting, the sudden rise of Chinese EVs in the way that it actually happened. But it's hard to say why exactly that happened. But if you go back and look at the reporting record, I think you'll see that there was a lot of reports on this leading up to it.
Yes. People believe what they want to believe, I think.
Could be, yes. Maybe journalists didn't do a good enough job reporting everything.
Impossible.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah. Impossible.
But it's also true, China is a very notoriously intransparent country. It's very hard to find really verified facts. I mean, you do cover the financial markets. there's a huge, the market went up, it goes down again. There's a shift in the venture capital space from private capital towards state capital. You only know it when you're here. It's only been reported like maybe a year later by people who read the data. So you really have to be on the ground to really feel what's happening, because otherwise there's no way to see all these figures, I think.
Sure, and I mean, you can, so there's a couple things there. It is more and more difficult now to access certain types of data outside of China. So, I use some data provider systems. One is called Chichacha. It's a company database. I can't get that when I'm outside of China. I just can't log into the system. Certain information providers like Wind, which is kind of like a terminal, like a Bloomberg terminal. They provide tons of different types of information. They also struggle to, this has been well reported, they struggle to provide certain types of information across the border to people that are outside of China. So you have that going on. You have this this intentional locking off of certain types of information. And you also have, not being, if you're here on the ground and you are going to events where you're mingling with venture capitalists, you can pick up on what's going on here. And as you said, the shift from, true private capital to state-backed venture capital, this is a huge shift that's happened in the past, I would say 6-7 years. And whether or not you would pick up on that outside of China, it's harder for sure.
And are multinationals or Western companies picking on that trend? Because it used to be China as a market, kind of China's source of innovation. Now it's also China's source of capital, basically. That's the dual circulation thing. You have to integrate completely in China, of course, to be successful. Is that something that they do understand? Because this is exactly what we're talking about. And it's not always reported, I think, in the right way, because it is so difficult to explain the story, I think.
Right. I think that multinationals understand this situation. So if we're just thinking about foreign venture capital, 5 years ago, I think foreign investors started realizing that, as I'm investing in this company, I'm going to be investing alongside a bunch of state-backed funds as well. What are the implications for that? What are the, are there, given all the U.S.-China geopolitical tensions, are there problems? Am I going to have problems in the U.S. Because I'm investing alongside a state-backed fund? Certainly the people doing due diligence on this type of work and then reporting back to the multinationals are very clear on that type of situation. I don't think that's so much of a mystery if you're actually working on the ground here.
Yes.
So I've been reading The Economist for 30 years, subscribing.
Since you were 10 years old? Wow.
Yeah, you're very flattering, but I've spent thousands of dollars on this publication, so I'm glad you're here.
But that's the point you want to make.
But it actually assumes a lot of China knowledge. I think it assumes an intelligent readership, and you go into such depth on the China reporting, and kind of like to talk to you about your recent long piece on Huawei. I mean, very revealing. I think people in DC need to read that. It's not just a threat to America. There's many things going on. And tell us the process of how, this is a 15-page briefing, incredible. Tell us the process how you came to that story and the challenges doing it.
Sure. Is it actually, I don't think it's 15 pages long, is it?
It's 13.
13? Okay. Wow. It can be hard to get the physical copy of The Economist in China, so I didn't realize it actually was that long. The challenges of reporting on Huawei. Huawei is, it's everywhere. I was just at this AI conference today, and Huawei has a huge booth. They're very, very big into AI. They have their own LLM. It's ubiquitous, and I think the company has tried to be open with foreign journalists for a while, to a certain degree, to a certain level. They did give a lot of interviews with Ren Zhengfei, the founder. In 2019, I think they were rolling him out a lot and doing a lot of stuff. That's over. He's definitely not talking with foreign journalists and maybe not local journalists. I haven't checked. So yeah, I mean, accessing them, talking, figuring out what's really going on. It's not a listed company, but they do publish financial reports, several of them every year. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. It takes time to build trust with contacts there, and I mean, I think I would argue that Huawei is a company that if you want to report on it well, you really need to go to Shenzhen and hang out in Huawei. So, visiting one of their many campuses, you're walking around and, it feels like you're in a French palace. I mean, with painted ceilings and just, I mean, it's mind blowing. And then you go somewhere else, you go to a nearby city and you're walking around through what looks like a European village with like trains and trolleys going by and like things that kind of look like churches and like massive libraries. So, I mean, it's just kind of like, oh my God, like what is going on here? It's all, I mean, it's meant to impress, right? It's meant to leave a deep impression on their foreign clients. When they're often flying in people from all over the world who want to see what their tech gear looks like, and I think it's very impressive when you roll up and you're like, there's a European village in this in Dongguan, which is where that's located. So yeah, all that's very interesting. Really, it comes down to kind of looking at these different areas that Huawei is pushing into, understanding how big the business has become, all the different areas that they're in. I mean, it's if you sit down and try to have a conversation with people there about this, you can go in, every direction in a short period of time and talk about 50 different industries. It's pretty hard to kind of narrow it down and figure out like what's really working and like what's not working. So yeah, it is a complex company to report on.
So their marketing communications was cooperative and helpful then.
Yeah. I mean, I think that they do have, they are arguably China's most important multinational. They have to have some kind of global journalist-facing media treatment. So yeah, they do. I mean, they do their best, I think. I would not describe Huawei as an open company that is just letting people talk with their executives all the time. That's not the case. But they do try to help people understand what the company is doing.
And just for our audience, just what's the gist of your takeaways from your story for our audience? The two or three things.
It's pretty basic. So the U.S. has been putting sanctions on Huawei for several years, trying to essentially cut it off from key technologies. Whether that's AI chips or really working with companies like Google, working with certain types of software suppliers like Oracle. So in 2020, I think a lot of those global companies basically had to stop working with Huawei. Maybe it started in 2019, and then the biggest part of those sanctions hit in 2020. So, the point was to really stop Huawei's global rise. My article argues that in many ways, the US sanctions have been effective. In other ways, they haven't. And the sanctions have forced Huawei to adapt. So they've built back their own systems that they used to rely on foreign suppliers for. They're building a lot of the key hardware that they have long relied on foreign companies for. So in many ways, they are, I would say, they are more resilient now than they were before the sanctions. Has it been a huge cost on the company? Absolutely. If the sanctions weren't in place, the company would use that money to spend on many other things. So, but I would argue, or I have argued, that they are in a better position to kind of weather some of these sanctions now. They can build a lot more stuff themselves. They've built their own enterprise resource planning software, which is, it's no small feat. They were cut off from the global provision of this type of software, and essentially they had to build their own to run their company. And now they can, they haven't done this yet, but they could turn around and say, oh, by the way, we're an ERP provider now. So instead of buying from Oracle, why don't you buy ERP from us? Yeah.
So Huawei has become now, of course, there were challenges for them. They do much better now, basically. But at the end of the day, they have a lot of issues accessing the European and the American markets. So Huawei is a flagship of many Chinese companies who want to go abroad, basically want to go global. But how really global can they go? Because at the end of the day, you could be the best Chinese company, you could be the best company in the world being in China. But you won't have access to the other Europe. That's going to be the result of it.
Sure. So they've lost a lot of access to rich world markets. They're not going to be providing their 5G, 6G, whatever G technology to a lot of rich countries that can pay for this stuff, right? And that's clear in their revenue. So they, I think I'd have to go back and look, but they were around 75% foreign revenues not too long ago, and now they're down to about 50%. Maybe it was 70, and now they're down to 50%. So they've become, since 2019, 2020, they've become just looking at revenues, a much less international company. But they are, they're still expanding, quite rapidly in South America or Africa, places where U.S. sanctions don't have the same type of reach. And they're not just expanding on their telecoms business; they're expanding with their cloud business and their devices business. So, these countries don't have as much money to spend. But as the global South becomes richer, I think the philosophy is, they will be spending more money on Huawei stuff.
Will this also mean in the long term that we in the developed countries, let's say the US and Europe, are shooting ourselves in the foot because now we keep them out, but eventually China will keep innovating and we're going to lose out because they develop superior technologies?
I think it's really hard. I mean, number one, I would say that the sanctions that the U.S. has on China have been effective on a very, very wide scale. So they've raised the cost of the most important chips. So that means that if you're a small company that's trying to do business, trying to run some sort of AI related operation, your costs are much higher now, and you might not even be able to get a hold of the right chips, right? I mean, Huawei's making AI chips, but their ability to provide those chips are limited at this point. Now, does that mean that this is going to hold China back, in the long run? I don't think so. I think it's having a big effect now, and it's affecting the level of kind of, I would say, low to mid-tier innovation that's taking place on things like AI. And I've walked through companies where they've showed me their device, and they're like, this is where the chip should be, but we can't get the chips. So yeah, it's definitely having an impact. I do think that the state is pushing enough money to this area, and they're perfecting their model for innovation. Yeah, I mean they will come around and break through some of these what they call chokeholds on their technology. Yeah, but the cost is massive at the same time.
Yep.
Well, I think we got to wrap up now. We're about out of time, but I would figure that you personally are accounting for something like 1% of business informed opinion about China in the world. So it's an awesome responsibility.
Wow.
Well, do the math. I mean, how many publications of the caliber of Economist are actually in China? It's not more than 10, right? So thank you very much for being with us and for sharing your thoughts.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.